time. Varsågod.
So welcome everyone to the series on lunch webinars on the interdisciplinary science at SLU. I'm Marie Stensike, Director of the Interdisciplinary Academy at SLU that arranged this lunch seminar. And if you think that my look today is not serious enough, I just want to say that outdoor recreation has been one of my main fields of research during the last decade, so I'm just in the right environment. Anyway, enough about me. Today we are most happy to have Malin Mobjörk, Senior Researcher Officer at Formas, giving a presentation on interdisciplinary research application. That's a very timely topic now when deadlines for application are getting close. But first, just a few words about the Interdisciplinary Academy. In short, IDA. It's an initiative at SLU that started in the fall 2022, aimed at increasing knowledge of and interest in interdisciplinary research among researchers at SLU, and also strengthen their ability to address research issues from interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspectives. And of course, by that also facilitate collaboration between scholars from various disciplines. The core of IDA are teams of researchers with different academic backgrounds that during 8 months work together on a complex research problem to jointly address the problem, and in doing so increase their knowledge of interdisciplinary working methods approaches. So these lunch webinars at the IDA, they're open to anyone inside and outside SLU, so most welcome to everyone. Now, Malin Mobjörk, our speaker today, she holds a PhD in Water and Environmental Studies from Linköping University. And before starting at Formas, she has a long-term experience from working in academic settings and research institutes. There will be time for questions and reflections after Malin's presentation. And the webinar will formally end at 12:55, but you are welcome to stay for another 30 minutes for informal discussions. Now, the screen is yours, Malin, please.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this interesting seminar and be interesting also for the conversation. But I will start with the presentation. So first, I will start sharing my screen. Hopefully that will be done easily. Let's see. Do you see the screen now?
Yes.
It's a presentation mode. Thank you. Super. So today, the topic is on interdisciplinary research and with a focus on applications, it says, but I will emphasize here that we really will also talk about the funding processes. How does the processes look like in the funding agency when it comes to assessing research? Because I think that is critical in terms of also how to relate to topics around interdisciplinarity. But briefly, just something about my background here in the context on interdisciplinarity. Besides working in different forms of interdisciplinary setting, already from a PhD to the various forms of inter research institutes, I've also been interested and conducted some studies myself on interdisciplinarity, both in terms of studying funding agencies, but also processes around interdisciplinarity in PhD education processes, for instance, and a little bit more conceptually. So I will also try to use some of those experience here in relationship to this conversation. And shortly about this today's overview on the presentation, I will start saying a little bit about interdisciplinary research and then probe into the concepts, because this is an umbrella term which could contain so many different forms, which is relevant also when we talk about how do you assess and evaluate interdisciplinary research. Then I will talk about some experiences, both from a survey, which was conducted in an organization called Science Europe, and then also the processes at Formas, where I particularly draw on the experience working with the National Climate Program, which works with targeted calls on climate issues, but then also the experience that also some aspects regarding Formas annual open call, which I assume all of you are well familiar with. But then also here, we will focus more deeply into the processes at Formas. So before talking about interdisciplinarity, I think it's important to reflect on why is interdisciplinary called for? What is the purpose? Why is this discussion taking place? And historically, if we try to look into, then I'm talking about in the 70s, there was a big movement talking about interdisciplinary research, which were maybe rather focusing quite on the critique towards the modern science and the tendency for specializations, which rather really made it into very narrow studies. But in the last 20, 30 years, interdisciplinarity is often called for when we talk about trying to work with challenges in society. If you choose the problem-solving approach or a challenge-driven approach, but that is called for this kind of processes. But when we talk about interdisciplinarity, we use those and we use them in relationship to an idea, what is a discipline? So this is quite complex, and a lot of the challenges around interdisciplinarity could also take place in monodisciplinary topics. So it's not, what I wanted to emphasize is that this is not strict concepts, and they are also, I think it needs to be reflected on when we talk about interdisciplinary, what we mean with those. And looking into literature around different forms, different modes of interdisciplinarity, we can identify both conversation which emphasize that with interdisciplinarity, that is called for in order to integrate, that we would like to integrate different forms of perspectives. And then we need to identify and clarify for ourselves in these processes, what is it we would like to integrate, who shall do the integration, and when in time will this integration take place? Is this already at the outset of research, or is this after research process? Another dimension important to recognize is, why are we calling for this? The motive behind research. We could have this more instrumental approach, contributing to addressing challenges in society. We would like to develop a new theory. We could also have this more critical approach, which very much focus on epistemological questions and the notions of science and how we think about science. And this stream of literature is quite strong, but it's very different from the others. And then we have this with the collaboration. Often when we talk about interdisciplinary, we call for this collaboration between different disciplines, but also, which is very strongly, not least the last 20 years, I would say, is also collaboration between academics and those actors outside academia, or practitioners, stakeholders, users. We can give them different labels. But this is also part of the structure in this kind of conversation. So using these, and this is just to give us a sense and the framework for what's coming next year, also when we talk about evaluating research and then processes for those, is that we can identify in the literature 3 major such as concepts. We have the multidisciplinarity, which is one field. We have the interdisciplinarity, is another kind of concept which circulates, which is then also often used as an umbrella term. And then we have the transdisciplinary aspects. So when we talk about this, the multidisciplinarity, then it's really more the cooperation between researchers, more staying in their discipline. So the integration is often in the more of a synthesis phase, that is often described almost as an ontology model, that you pursue, you have a joint interest in, for instance, climate change. And then you, with your different disciplines, you try to explore this area and trying to find where in the synthesis phase. But the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinarity is much more developed in terms of also identifying the joint problem description and how to advance methods and the entry point in conducting the research. But with a big difference that in the transdisciplinary debate, you have a lot of focus on so that you also collaborate with societal actors in various forms. And all of these concepts could be could be looked into much deeper. But I think the essence here, what I would like to emphasize is when we talk about assessing research and evaluating research, it's very different whether we talk about a research practice which builds upon a cooperation between researcher and practitioners to develop new forms of understanding and methods and joint problem description, compared to a multidisciplinary approach, which is much more in lines with already conceived practices and entry points in how to conduct the research. So that's why I would like to emphasize this, and that might be very relevant both in terms for when you apply, when you think about where are you situated in your work process, but then also how to describe the work process. So I think this is to have this as a context in terms of the subsequent stages in the research process. But now going into then some experience on interdisciplinary research in funding, among funding actors, but then also organization. I would like to start with a survey within Science Europe. That is an organization who is a member organization with it's approximately 40 research funding organizations and research performing organizations in Europe. And they have different working groups, and I'm involved in the working group focus on the green and digital transition. And in the debate, we are maybe almost 20 member organization in this working group. And in this conversation we had related to the green and digital transition, the member felt that they wanted to understand a little bit what kind of interdisciplinary programs or initiatives that has been undertaken among the member organization in Science Europe. So we conducted last year a survey where we focused then on how does these different organizations approach and relate to interdisciplinarity in general, but then also specifically towards the field of green and digital transition. And just to which I think was quite interesting in the result of this survey, it was that the general approach from many organizations on interdisciplinarity is that they avoid deliberately to make a very strict definition what is actually interdisciplinary, what that is. Rather, they emphasized the importance to this is a flexible concept, and it could, by defining it very strictly, rather could hamper the activities that is undertaken, that you can almost miss the goal if you make a too formalized definition. And that was also considered because besides the survey, we also made some focus groups among the members. That was also really emphasized. The reason for this is that disciplines constantly evolve, and we need to have a flexible approach and related to what is the research is trying to achieve. That is essential. But when it comes to this with the interdisciplinary research, it has a general take that it is called for in order to address societal challenges, and that collaboration is key in these processes, but that to have a flexible approach in terms of definitions. In terms of the funding of these interdisciplinary activities, the tendency among then is particularly the funding organizations that it follows the same practices as with monodisciplinary instruments, but with the emphasis that to have this challenge-oriented perspective, and also often a specific attention to the potential impacts of research that is closer to this, that it also has how it will benefit in societies. And what was also discussed in this result is that the assessment of quality very much are in lines with the recent COARA initiatives, which I think I'm not sure whether you are already familiar with this one, but this was, so I think it's important to raise that. And the COARA initiative, that was, it's a coalition for advancing research assessment. And this one was agreed last year in July 2022. And it is an initiative that comes from the European Union Commission, Science Europe is involved, and European University Associations. And there has been more than 350 organizations from 40 countries involved in this process. And Formas has been active also throughout this process. And the agreement is to emphasize how to advance research assessment in terms of being more open in the processes. And for instance, what they do in this agreement is to emphasize, to recognize the diversity of contribution and careers in research. So this, I think, is this important. The initiative both relates to funding organizations and to performing organizations. It's also what they emphasize is that research assessment should focus on the qualitative aspects in the evaluation, for which peer review is central. But this use of quantitative indicators should be used with a responsible and well cared how to use the quantitative indicators. It also has quite strong writings around the inappropriate use of journal and publication-based metrics. That, for instance, a journal impact factor should be avoided as just using as a separate entry point in the assessment. And it also calls for a learning process to review and develop research assessment criteria, tools, and processes. And I think this is important to bear in mind that this movement is on the way in the universities, and there is 17 Swedish funding agencies and universities so far that has signed for this agreement to work along these lines, which I think is an interesting development also in terms when we talk about interdisciplinarity. So with this as a back, this said, I would like then to enter more deeply into the Formas and Formas process and how we at Formas work with the assessment processes. Most likely all of you are already familiar with Formas, but Formas is the Swedish Research Council where we talk about the Council for Sustainable Development, but we both emphasize the high quality research, the need-driven aspects of research, innovation, also in terms in research, and also has a mandate to synthesize research to support environmental goals and to also play a role in this taking part in dialogue and collaboration. And when you apply at Formas, I think you also have noticed that we also use the Sustainable Development Goals as a way to structure and to see how the portfolio is related to these goals. And Formas' vision is this: with the knowledge builds a sustainable world. And there are three major areas of responsibility. It's environment, agriculture sciences, and spatial planning. And we are also the host of 4 national research programs, one on climate, one on food, one on sustainable spatial planning, and then one on oceans and water. And myself, I've been particularly working with the National Research Program on climate, so that's one I know best. But then, of course, I know Formas as an overall agency as well, of course. But I would like to just emphasize that that field is the one I know best. So when we talk about Formas and the key steps, how we work with evaluation processes, I would like to touch upon both the call text, conditions, criteria, because that is one package I think is important to relate to. I would like to highlight aspects how we work with the composition of review panel and the instructions to reviewers. Also the instructions to applicants, because that is related to these. And also this package around the arrangement and dynamics of a panel meeting, because I think research has been strong on showcasing how important those aspects also are. So these are the 4 areas I will talk about in terms of the processes at Formas. But first, something about Formas calls, because I think that might be also good to see a bit the overview. This is a snapshot for 2021 in terms of the budget sizes, like percentages on the budget. So we have annual open calls, which stands for approximately 40%. And national research program, these 4 I mentioned, we had 39%. And then we have strategic innovation program, international calls, other thematic calls, and direct payment as well. But this is just a snapshot for 2021. I could say that 2021 normally international calls is higher than 1%, but what I would like to emphasize is that with the annual open call and the natural research program, they are approximately the same size. And this is also a picture if you also choose it last year or 2020 or even 2019. So this is a relationship. And in my talk regarding how we work with assessment processes, I will only focus on the annual open calls and natural research programs because they have the most similar process. So you know. Okay, so these 2 main call categories. Formas open call, that is enable researchers to formulate their own research question in lines of Formas 3 major areas. We have, it is the 10 review panels, and the researcher suggests, I think, the first 3 choices, rank them the first, second, and third, which review panel you would like to belong to. And then it is a general take in the Formas open call is that multi or interdisciplinary applications are encouraged, but it's not mandatory. Calls in the natural research program, they should contribute to addressing prioritized societal challenges within their 4 areas. They work with targeted calls within the realm of the program area. Multi and interdisciplinary applications are normally always encouraged, but seldom mandatory. You could find application where it calls where it actually is mandatory, but normally it's encouraged, but not mandatory. So this follows, according to what I said about the Science Europe study, that also Formas use a quite flexible approach. We don't pursue a strict definition of what multi or interdisciplinary is. It's open, it's rather how it speaks to the call and the research task itself. So when we talk about the review panels, as I said, the review process is critical. And here I would like to emphasize that the review panels at Formas, the size could vary from 12, 15 to 25 panel members. The number depends on how many applications there is to review. So for instance, in the open calls, it's often approximately 25 panel members. In some of the targeted calls, which maybe have much less applications, there is a smaller panel member, a smaller amount of number. But what is always included in the review panels is that 3/4 are active researchers, almost exclusively from outside Sweden. And then it is approximately 1/4 societal actors. They are normally from Sweden, but that also depends on call, of course, but normally from Sweden. And all panel members evaluate all aspects. So if we don't divide that to say that it is the active researcher, the researcher who assess scientific quality and societal actors, social relevance, all members have the same responsibility to evaluate all aspects. And it's also what we emphasize in the review panels is the broad international competence to have gender equality and identifying expert who has an experience in inter and multidisciplinary context that you would like to have. You search for broad experiences to have a good balance in the review panel. And probing a little bit deeper into this, for instance, then if I provide an example more from working with the targeted calls, then when you have written the call, when the call is out, you start recruiting the panel, review panel you need for that call. You start with the competence mapping. What kind of competences will be needed in order to make a proper evaluation of the incoming applications, and to find this composition of the panel to reflect the topics which are part of the call. But when you have that in place, the panel, and you have received the applications after the deadline, the panel members are then stating their competence level for each application. Of course, not if they have conflict of interest, but otherwise. They state the competence level, and you low, mid, or high level competence. And then the distribution of applications are based on this competence level. And if you notice that you don't have medium or high competence in the panel you have set up for this call, you then start recruit external reviewers. So you have a competence which are suited the actual application you have received. And I think that is a way to really trying to ensure that you have a good balance in terms that you have reviewers who consider themselves having good competence in order to make a proper assessment. So I think that is, and this is taking place, and it's a quite careful work, of course, in order to do this. And I think that is also an important aspect in the review process. So this is one aspect I wanted to highlight regarding the process. And then taking a slightly different approach on this, how do we think in terms of enabling interdisciplinary research? I think that then slightly, it's of course the composition of a review panel is one aspect, but then it is also already in the writing of a call text. And this is maybe particularly if you work with a targeted call, how do you write? So because you would like in a targeted call, you have an idea what it is, what kind of research you would like to be in, what kind of challenges that should be addressed. But at the same time, it is to write in an inclusive way, because it is researcher who will be able to identify what is actually the best research here. So I think this is a very careful process. And I think it's also, which makes it challenging and difficult for talking about that, because of power relationship. As a funding agency, you need to be careful not being prescriptive, but at the same time highlighting what is it you see, have identified in terms of what kind of research you would like to encourage. So this is a careful balance, which also is a balance in this setting and this room when I talk about these topics. But this writing, to have this inclusive writing, is key. Then it is to identify a review panel which speaks to both what is it you would like to achieve and the applications you have received. Then it is how we apply evaluation criteria, and I will soon return to those, regarding also how they pick up some of these aspects around interdisciplinary research. And then we have instructions to reviewers and the organizations of panels. And before, so the instructions to reviewers, and this is also part in the context, which is also the same instructions to the applicants. It is that the assessment is based on what is written in the application, nothing else. One should not take into account other aspects that you know research. It's what is written in the application. So this is like as important for the reviewers as for applicants to pay attention to. And it is also that the organization of panel meetings is also taking steps in several cases. So today, it is always a pre-meeting with the reviewers before they start doing their work in order to be able to talk through the criteria and really provide this instruction, what is essential to pay attention to in the assessment process. But then it is also a meeting before the actual panel meeting. There's a second after the first individual assessment has been conducted, then there's a pre-meeting where it's also talked through and this shortlist is discussed based on the individual level. So there are two important meetings before the actual panel meeting. And during the panel meeting, it's also, it's also how that is organized in terms of focusing on how the process in terms of power balances and ethical aspects in the work process. So Formas here try to have several meetings with the chair and the co-chair in order to create that kind of aspects and thoughtful processes. When it comes to this, the evaluation criteria, I see the time is running. Formas normally apply 5 criteria. It's 3 related to scientific quality. It's 2 related to societal relevance. If you apply in the Formas annual open calls, it is the social relevance criteria is combined because this project budget is much smaller in that call. So that is one aspect why it's combined. In the targeted calls, they could be much larger, and then it's relevance to separate these two. But this is also constantly a process to develop. How should you identify and which kind of criteria is relevant? So in order to know, it's always to go to the specific call and follow what is actually, how does it look in this particular call? But this is this is from a basic how it looks now in targeted calls. But each call has its own features, and so it's also the criteria are related to those in order to pick up what is essential. But in the evaluation criteria, it is also a lot of sub-criteria which are guiding the instructions to the reviewers. And I think writing applications is also important here to pay attention to those. So in terms of the interdisciplinarity and aspects related to those aspects, for instance, beneath the criterion research question, it includes a sentence which says that evaluators must positively recognize multi- and interdisciplinary approaches when these are applicable to the research question focus. So that is a way to encourage to positively recognize those when it's relevant. In terms of the criteria on scientific competence, it also includes writings regarding how to value competence, that the evaluation should focus on content and quality of publications rather than where they are published. So this is a way also to focus on this quality aspects and content and not impact factors or similar things. And that it also emphasized that publications are only one part, what is factored in order to identify, in order to assess scientific competence, that there are other aspects as well, which is critical. And regarding communications with stakeholders and users, it's also an emphasis because this is very different depending on what kind of research you have, whether you have a close proximity to societal actors or whether those are more distant. So this should be balanced to have this qualitative aspects on the different ways in which these aspects comes in and how to evaluate those. So I think this is just to provide some examples on how to balance this with the flexibility, but at the same time highlight that this is important to pay attention to. So, because time is running quickly, we should have some time to talk. So just a few summaries, some form of takeaway messages here maybe. It is to really go back to this, that interdisciplinarity is a flexible context, and different funding agencies have different aims and assessment processes and relationship to this. And when writing applications, that it is the call text and the criteria related to that is key to pay attention to. And also this with the sub-criteria to also think through how do you speak to those different forms. But I think I should stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Malin. Very interesting, and yeah, a silent applaud from all of us.